Hello again, this is Dr. Kalam, and in this brief module, this brief lecture, I'll talk about the hiring process again and the interview process. And we'll specifically cover Learning Objective 7.1, which lists and gives examples of the main types of selection interviews as part of the process. So let's get into that. We've talked about this in another chapter, but we'll reiterate some of the things that we've learned in the past. So one of the key things that we've already understood about types of interviews, or the basic types of interviews, is that there are structured versus unstructured. So an unstructured or non-directive interview process generally has no set format. So this might be most appropriate for behavioral interviews, or maybe the one where the final hiring decision is made with a hiring manager. This might occur after the series of initial screening interviews and panel interviews have already taken place. And so structured or directive interviews, on the other hand, generally identify specific questions ahead of time, list those questions, and they're posed to weigh possible alternatives, answers, and for appropriateness. For example, there are certain types of answers. There's no specific right or wrong answer in a structured interview questionnaire administered by a panel, for example. But we might look for questions that relate to supervisory tactics that a supervisor might take under certain conditions. Maybe they had, for example, an employee who had a lateness problem, and to avoid behavioral issues, the supervisor, if we pose the question as to what the supervisor would do when this person, let's say it was a female who had children and was exhibiting late behaviors, what would you do as a supervisor to deal with that problem? So that's an interesting one, and that's a common supervisory issue. And we would look for answers like, I might discuss the situation with the employee and figure out if they have a permanent situation where they need help with adjustment in the schedule, and those kinds of responses would be appropriate. Where other types of responses might include things like, as a supervisor, I would have to write that person up and look for termination based on progressive discipline. So we would look for that as a negative aspect of that person's ability to function based on the structured directed interview process. So another thing that we need to look at when we're talking about basic types of interviews is the interview content. What kind of questions do we ask and we shouldn't ask? So interviews can be classified according to the nature of their questions, such as situational interviews, behavioral, job-related, for example. In a situational interview, you can ask a candidate. You ask a candidate what his or her behavior would be in a given situation. And as I mentioned previously, we look at certain types of actions that a supervisor, for example, or an employee would take under a particular or a given situation. And we'd actually present that scenario to that supervisor and that person, that interviewee, and look for specific types of responses. In job-related interviews, the interviewer asks applicants about job-related experiences that happened in their previous positions. Other types of questions might include, lesser used type of questions. For example, in a stress interview, the interviewer seeks to make the applicant uncomfortable with occasionally rude questions, maybe. And puzzle questions are also another type of popular questions. But the rude questions, the uncomfortable questions, are really important to understand how they're administered. We don't broadcast what they are. we make sure we moderate how intense, per se, those questions are, and then look for certain types of responses under pressure or stress. Um, in high volume manufacturing call center environments, an applicant's ability to deal with high stress environments is important. So we can ascertain that through those types of questions. And how should we conduct the interview? So employers administer interviews in various ways. One-on-one interviews, as I discussed, that might be a screening type of interview initially. Panel interviews are very, very common these days. They include maybe 5, 6 people from inside the department, and maybe one from HR or one from a different department that has relationship with the person working there. And sequential or all at once types of questions, or we might have. I've been to an interview where I was there for a whole day, and I went through a series of questions on a one-on-one basis with the hiring manager. I went through a panel interview a couple of hours later. I went to lunch with the employees that I would work with, and then we had computerized personality test after that. And then I had a final exit interview with another group of administrators. And it lasted an entire 8 hours. So they range from 1 hour, 2 hour stints to all the way through a whole day where questions and interviews are asked all in one sequence after another, or sequentially. Let's talk about specifics with phone. First typical interview process that takes place, or part of the process, is probably a phone interview, and this can be more useful than a face-to-face interview for judging one's conscientiousness, intelligence, and interpersonal skills. If you get a call on the phone about a particular position, or if you call a particular applicant about a position, you'll usually call them and say, listen, can you speak now? This is so-and-so. We're calling to do initial screening for the position of so-and-so. Can we set up a convenient time where you can spend half an hour on the phone with us and go through our initial phone screening? The next one is we could, and I've seen also in many cases where computer-based job interviews take place, and this is kind of a job where candidates' job oral and or keypad replies are obtained in response to computerized prompts. And these days, Skype can be used, or other forms of electronic media where you can see the people and the people can see you, and you can see the applicants more clearly, and you have a panel there. So those are quite common as well, where you can judge a person's, you can make good assumptions about a person's abilities based on those types of interviews. And finally, web-based interviews with phone and tablet, video functionalities, FaceTime or Skype, as I mentioned, do in fact serve as a screening. They're very rarely the final interview. So if you set up a web-based interview, if the person is a final candidate, you would ask them to come in and meet with you at some other time. You wouldn't make that the final interview. Anyway, so that's the end of this brief mini lecture about basic types of interviews. The next one in this module or week, this week's lectures, is on Chapter 8, and we'll discuss Chapter 8.3. Okay, thanks. Stay tuned and see you in a